Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study in the Gospel of Luke. I just got home from a Christmas party. It is, let's see what time it is, 10:30 at night, and I ate my body weight in food. That's not an exaggeration. It was a proper Christmas fiesta, and ate a lot of food. So I'm going to be trying to discuss this chapter and speak coherently while doing all that digesting. I don't know how this is going to go, but I guess we'll find out. Got to stay on schedule here, so we can't. Thought about just going to bed and not shooting this, but figured I better. Okay, we are finally in Luke chapter 7, and let's read verse 1. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now, if you were with us for the chapter 6 study, you'll know that Jesus has just finished up this long teaching section where he was talking about loving your enemies and judging other people. He encouraged people to be good trees that bore good fruit, and he spoke to them about building their lives on the solid foundation of his words and applying his words. So that is what is being referred to when it says he finished his sayings. Now let's read verses 2 through 7. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and to heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who builds our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. And when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed." So we're in Capernaum. It's kind of Jesus' home base. And there's this Roman centurion. I kind of looked this up. I kind of had a general idea for what a centurion was, but I wanted to be a little bit more specific. When you think about the Roman army, a centurion is one level of officer within that army. I think the largest section of the army was known as a legion, and a legion was 5,000 men. But each legion was made up of 10 cohorts. So that would have been 500 people in each cohort. And then within each cohort, there were 6 centuries. So a century could be anywhere from about 80 to 100 men. And so the centurion was in charge of those 80 to 100 men. And then each centurion would have reported to whatever the guy running the cohort was called. So that's the role that this centurion had, and so he's definitely a man. You got 80, 100 men under him. Definitely a manager level position he's got going on here. And he has this servant who's sick. Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 8, verse 6, that he was suffering from some kind of paralyzing disease. And then Luke just told us that he was at the point of death. And text tells us that he was very valued by the centurion. And when the centurion heard that Jesus was in the area, what he did was he got some of the elders of the Jews to petition Jesus to heal his servant. So these elders came to Jesus and they pleaded with him, and they said that the centurion, he was a worthy man, that he had actually built them their synagogue, which was, that was pretty interesting. Probably didn't happen a whole lot. But the relationship between this Roman centurion and the Jews of Capernaum was probably somewhat of an anomaly, because for the most part, it doesn't seem like the Jews really got along with the Romans. The Romans had conquered the Jewish people and now subjected them to taxes and certain other controls, and Jews didn't like that. They wanted independence. The Jews obviously saw them as the oppressors, so there's a lot of tension there. The Romans looked down on a lot of the Jews. So the friendly relationship between the centurion and the Jews here in Capernaum was probably pretty unique, and I think there's an application for us, and that is that we should be really careful before we stereotype somebody into a particular category without getting to know them. We may be losing out on some of the best relationships of our lives because we're too quick to stereotype and not quick enough to evaluate somebody on their individual characteristics. The Jews could have just written this guy off, never given him a chance, thought, he's just like the rest of those Romans, but actually they had like this really friendly relationship. And when the centurion needs something, he goes and he gets these Jews. Maybe he didn't think Jesus would even talk to him. I'm sure Jesus would have. He talked to other centurions, but anyway, they had this great relationship, and I think there's a lot of lessons there for us to learn. People should be evaluated as individuals on what they stand for and what they support, not just lumped into a good or bad category because they look a certain way or they have a certain background. And definitely in our culture, there's a ton of application for that in our country, or my country, at least in the United States, for sure. So Jesus, having been asked by these elders to come and to heal the man's servant, Jesus obliged them and he went with them. And on the way he headed out on the way to the centurion's house. But when he got close to the centurion's house, the centurion sent some of his friends out the front door, and they kind of intercepted Jesus when he was almost there. And they told him that he didn't need to come into the house because the centurion didn't feel worthy to have him as a guest. Instead, the centurion just wanted him to say the word. And he knew that that would be enough for his servant to be healed. And I think this is pretty incredible. Well, it says that Jesus, I think we'll talk about that in a second. But here was a man who he wasn't a Jew. He didn't have a Messiah, the Messiah figure in his traditions and his backgrounds. And yet he had the utmost respect for Jesus, and he recognized him as somebody who was worthy of great honor. And I think there's an application for us you look at the way that the Jews, his friends, present him to Jesus. They said, he is a worthy man. He's a good guy. He's worthy to have this miracle. And yet the centurion, when he describes himself, how does he do it? He says, I am not worthy to have you. I think that's a pretty healthy attitude for us as Christians to have today. Here you have a guy who's clearly, his virtues are seen by those in his community. They know him to be an upright man and a good man and a kind man and a generous man. So his works are shining for the glory of God. But at the same time, his self-assessment of himself is still very humble. He doesn't allow the way that other people view him to give him a big head or to become arrogant about just how righteous he actually is. No, he remains humble, and he recognizes that he's still very unworthy. And that needs to be our attitude as well. Perhaps our good works, what's that verse in the Sermon on the Mount? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So people are going to be able to see that we're virtuous if we're doing our best to follow God, but at the same time our assessment of ourselves should be that I still recognize that I am unworthy of every grace that Jesus has given to me. It's interesting to me that Jesus was willing to go into the homes of people who saw themselves as unworthy, but he often was much more hesitant to go into the homes of people who thought themselves very worthy. He went to eat with tax collectors and sinners and this Gentile centurion, or he was willing to go into his house and to go meet him. However, we don't see Jesus spending a lot of time in the homes of Pharisees. He does spend some time there, right? But a lot of his time is spent among the poor, the humble, the unworthy, the opposite of the self-righteous, whatever that is, the unself-righteous. There you go. Kind of a side note here, it was interesting to me that Jesus appears in every way to be willing to go into the centurion's house He obviously knew that he wouldn't do that because he knew everything and he had foresight of the future, but he shows his willingness to enter this Gentile's house and doesn't seem hesitant about it at all. And in the first century, it seems like the Jews really had a problem with going into Gentiles' houses. We kind of see that in Acts chapter 10 in a story about Peter and going to the house of another centurion named Cornelius. So the Jews didn't go into Gentile homes. And I think that had more to do with the Jews saw themselves as superior to the Gentiles rather than the other way around. It's not that they weren't invited, it was just that they abstained because they saw the Gentiles as almost like a second class to them. And I can't find anywhere in the Old Testament where this was commanded, where Jews were told that they couldn't go into a Gentile's house or else they would be unclean. And I think this rule may have originated in some of the oral traditions of the rabbis, not actually in God's written law, but some of the Jews made a really big deal about this. But evidently, Jesus didn't really think that this was that big of a deal. He apparently didn't have an issue with going into a Gentile's home and healing somebody. So if you were a Gentile, and especially a Gentile, maybe somebody who's studying about Jesus' life, coming to faith, or somebody who was already baptized, somebody's already a Christian, and you're reading Luke's gospel, which was addressed to Gentile Christians, that would probably communicate a lot. You know, the average Jew wasn't willing to come to your house, but Jesus would have been willing to come to your house. So that says a lot about the fact that Jesus didn't hold the Gentiles in the same kind of contempt that his contemporary Jews held them. Okay, verses 8 and 9 and 10. This is the centurion here still sending this message to Jesus. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. Turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. This centurion, he knew the power of a word that was backed by authority. Being a man of authority himself and also submitting to the authority structure of the Roman legion and the Roman cohort, he knew what authority was, and he knew when a word carried authority and when it didn't. And so the centurion asked Jesus to use this authority and to command this healing to happen. This centurion's word alone had an effect on 80 to 100 men at any given time, and to bring them to attention and to direct them wherever he wanted to send them. And he believed that Jesus' words were enough to bring nature to attention and to direct it however he wanted, and he was right. It's not uncommon for the Gospels to mention people marveling at Jesus' miracles and at his words, but it is somewhat rarer to find Jesus marveling at a man. In this case, marveling at this man's faith. He makes this rather shocking statement after he marvels at the centurion's faith. He says, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So to a closed-minded Jew like the Pharisees or the scribes or the Sadducees, this probably would have been pretty offensive. They thought they were pretty hot stuff. And Jesus had spent quite a bit of time with them in his ministry. He had a lot of exposure to them and what they stood for and what they believed, and he probably would have he definitely would have grown up around some of those men. And yet, what he says is, I've not found greater faith in any of those men, any of the religious teachers or rabbis that I've been around. There's no greater faith that I've observed than what I've seen just now in this centurion. And to an open-minded Jew, this statement probably would have reaffirmed something that John the Baptist had taught them all the way back in John chapter 3. Well, it's in another gospel, but John chapter 3, verse 8, where John taught the people not to rely on their bloodline or their descendants from Abraham to get them into a right relationship with God. They weren't going to be able to trust the fact that they were Abraham's relatives to produce some kind of great faith in them, or to make them what they should be in the eyes of God. It also would have been a lesson that the Jews had things to learn from the piety of Gentiles. Most Jews probably didn't think they had anything to learn from Gentiles in the way of religion, but they definitely did. I think it's also pretty incredible that the centurion was able to recognize Jesus and the authority that he had. And I wonder if that's because the centurion didn't carry around all of the baggage of the Jewish traditions and the Jewish expectations. The Jews had all kinds of ideas about who the Messiah was going to be, what he was going to look like, what his kingdom was going to be like, probably his hair color and his eye color. I don't know. They had a lot of traditions about it. And they had kind of formed this image in their mind. The problem was that it had been formed on assumptions rather than on actual details given by God and the prophecies about the Messiah. So the Jews had all kinds of this stuff, but this centurion as a Gentile, he wouldn't have had any of those presuppositions. He was just evaluating Jesus based on the evidence of his life and his words, and he came to the conclusion that this was a man from God. And there's an application there for us. Sometimes people, I would say like myself, who have been Christians for a long time or have grown up in the church, sometimes we're just steeped in religious traditions and doctrines. And we need new Christians with fresh eyes on biblical texts and on the way that the church does things and the way that it operates and the things that it teaches. We need someone who isn't quite as familiar with traditional Christianity as we are to help us see things afresh again and to catch some things that perhaps we've allowed to bleed over the line between what is tradition and what is dogma, what is opinion and what is just the way that we do things and what is doctrine. Because unfortunately, a lot of times our traditions can become doctrine over time as we forget that they were just our traditions in the beginning and not the direction and the command of God. So let me read this. I think I said it maybe a little bit better in here. There's so much tradition in the church, so many long-held ways of doing things, and there is a comfort that comes along with the familiarity of those practices, that's for sure. But if we aren't careful, that familiarity can become dogmatic. The church needs new Christians with fresh eyes on the story of Jesus to remind us where our tradition has bled into truth. So don't discredit. I think my wife was helpful to me in this way. She wasn't as familiar with just the church traditions and teachings and the traditional interpretations of certain texts when she got serious about her faith, and helped me to think through some things, I think, a little bit better, a little bit more clearly. And so don't discount the perspective of a new Christian or a new Bible student. They can bring a lot of value to the table, especially to some old, curmudgeons who have been talking about the same old things in the same old ways for a long time. And I lump myself into that group as somebody who grew up in the church. And sometimes I do have difficulty kind of sifting through what's tradition and what's truth and making clear lines of distinction there. It can be hard because we are trained sometimes to see and read the Bible through the filter that we grew up with, or through certain eyes, and you can get caught up in that stuff and end up binding your traditions on other people, or binding things that shouldn't be bound, or loosing things that shouldn't be loosed, or permitting things that the Bible forbids, and sometimes you don't even realize it. It's almost a blind spot just because your mind just thinks that way because it was trained to think that way. So for those of us who are in that position maybe and been in the church forever, those new people can bring a ton of value. Keep that in mind before you discount what they have to say. So after marveling at the centurion's faith, Jesus healed the man's servant, and the centurion's friends found him well when they got back to the house. All right, well, that is the opening 10 verses of chapter 7. We'll press on in the next video. I hope you guys have a good day, and I will talk to you later.